Hi, everyone. So, today or this week's lectures are focused on publics and public engagements with health and medicine. So, that's what we're going to go over. My plan is to just do one longer lecture video and then put timestamps in it for each of the readings. So if there's a particular reading that you want to engage with or listen to me talk about because it was harder for you, you can use the timestamps to help you out and get through that. Before we jump into that, there's one thing, two things I just want to say I'm just like entertained by. One is, how many of you have watched Tiger King? And is there a single person in that Netflix series that is redeemable in any way? Or do they all just suck the most? Because I recently watched it after I got overwhelmed by all of the memes for Tiger King. And I was just like, oh my God, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. Okay. All right, okay. And it was a good time. So share with me your thoughts about Tiger King if you have watched it. And if you're not going to watch it, also feel free to share with me why you're not going to. The other thing that's kind of entertaining for me is every time I go live on YouTube, I have to like take a thumbnail picture, and I'm pretty sure I just have no idea how to properly do that because I feel like it looks like the silliest thing ever. But I imagine that's just like everyone when you have to do something of yourself. But, you know, whatever, good times. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump in. So today we're focused on issues of the public and public engagements. So last week's lecture and reading was focused on the personal, technical, and public spheres of argument and introducing us to these public engagements. Each of our articles today, at least to some extent, interact with that and continue our conversation about publics and about public engagement. So if you haven't figured out that one of the big themes of this second half of the semester is going to be public argument and public spheres and the role of different groups within public spheres, hopefully now you're starting to get that figured out. So the Public Engagements with Health and Medicine article gives us a nice introduction to the multiplicity of articles, directions of research that you can take. So this is the introduction to a special issue. So its purpose is to give you an overview of rhetoric's engagement with public health and medicine. If there's something that you find particularly interesting, confusing, perplexing, leads you to want to do more inquiry, it also functions as a great kind of reading list for you to go through and for you to explore that with. It's also an excellent kind of follow-up from Goodnight to take that transition from spheres of argument to public engagements on a particular issue and a particular controversy, or something that has been the source of greatest confusion when we think about spheres, which is health, medicine, personal livelihoods, something that remains so mystified in American society. So from that, they're kind of taking, so the authors of this piece is taking a two-part argument as they set up their special issue. The first is that in an era that is punctuated by calls for public participation in health and medicine, we need to assess the multiple ways publics already engage with health knowledge formation, contestation, decision-making, and practices. So these are the things that I'm going to encourage you to do more to explore, right? What is the role of contestation, decision-making, argument, and engagement when it comes to health and medicine? How are we seeing some of those roles unfold in the coronavirus epidemic that we are facing, or pandemic that we're facing? The second part of the argument is that because health and medicine participates in shaping the contours of our collective, networked, and global life, we need to understand how citizens, institutions, and movements increasingly organize around biological, medical, and health matters. It seems like so much of our lives get organized around that. So many of the arguments and concerns about rural, urban, suburban life is about health and medicine. So many of the arguments about the coronavirus, for example, get filtered through the way in which we organize our lives. My family lives in Kansas, and I have these phone conversations with my father very frequently where he remains kind of a skeptic around the coronavirus and the impact of the coronavirus for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that the areas of the country that are the most impacted are coastal, highly populated centers. So New York, California, like Seattle and Washington, Atlanta here in Georgia, parts of Florida, and also how we prioritize life, right? These arguments about how much do we need to care or be concerned when the people who are the most affected are those with existing illnesses that we are extending their lives for, or the elderly who are living past their time anyway. So like, right. And so it then becomes kind of interesting to think about the ethical engagements as well as the deliberative discussions for how we engage in decision making and organizing our lives and thinking about the effects of social distancing versus economic factors when it comes to health, medicine, and public arguments. So some of the key questions that we get from this are: what is a public or the public? What makes up any of these publics or makes up the public? You see that they engage one another in dialogue about matters of mutual interest. That's what this author is telling us a public is, and that our knowledge can't just be technical, right? We have to be able to speak and interact with each other and bring as many people in to engage in those matters of mutual interest. So from this, we're taken into two kind of case categories or case studies around public engagements of health and medicine. So the first one is the article on AIDS activism, which is an excellent engagement with Goodnight to show how arguments about the same controversy can develop across all three spheres. The second one is the Pizzullo article on National Breast Cancer Awareness, because this article then introduced us to different definitions of public spheres, as well as the notion of counterpublics, or those who are in opposition, to think about activism, but also the way in which arguments and activism in being reactive can get co-opted into things like greenwashing and pinkwashing. So you see kind of the dark side or the negative implications that have to get overcome with activism when the translation of needs that occurs becomes a false consciousness almost around major issues. So let's talk about the AIDS activism article and about the rejuvenation of the public sphere. So a couple of things that I want to make mention of as we get into these. Also, I'm going to make a quick note around here is where that starts. So those things are, this is an excellent article that summarizes and pulls some of the key quotations and moments from the Goodnight article that you read last week. So if you are able to follow this literature review and the engagement that's happening with Goodnight to start applying the personal, technical, and public spheres, then it seems like you're getting a good understanding. If not, maybe this can help you re-look at that article and figure out how to follow it effectively, or to bring about the questions for what you may or may not understand so far. The second thing is, and this is just kind of a passing moment within the article, but the piece brings us back to and makes a connection to Burke, who we've read in the first half of the semester, for thinking about what trained incapacity is. And so I would encourage you to pay a little closer attention to that small section, because it's relatively small, but is valuable when you think about who we have read so far and some of the engagements. So as we start to think about AIDS activism as our interesting kind of test case for public engagements with health and medicine, we see a history of communities engaging the medical community with skepticism, arguing against doctors, researchers, and the pharmaceutical industry. We see a lot of this skepticism that this is where you can also begin to contrast what key, important, and effective engagement and criticism of doctors' health and medicine looks like, and compare it to maybe the less sensical version of that we tend to see in anti-vaccination advocacy and activism. So from that, we're getting two argumentative practices that AIDS activists engage in. So these are a part of our heuristic vocabulary for what argumentation looks like. We're getting to see what argumentation looks like as activist strategies within publics. And so we're given two examples of what becomes necessary and what can happen. The first is redefinition, which our authors define as stripping away the mystique that surrounds science and enables others to participate in the discourse surrounding AIDS research. So what they see in AIDS activism is that redefinition means that they're redefining AIDS across the spheres of argument. So they're redefining it from being purely personal or purely technical, and demanding that it be interpreted and defined and understood as a public issue. So how are they doing that? There are a few ways that they do that. The first is making a series of demands that it's a political issue. The second is looking at previous activism. So the one that they reference most consistently is ACT UP, as evidence of the way in which it becomes a public and political concern. They go through it and they cite scientists, doctors, and these successful activists for making the public concern, public demand, and public engagement with these issues. So if people in the technical sphere already, right, are making the arguments that you need to, and are extending their technical expertise to make public arguments or political arguments about AIDS and HIV, then it has to be a public issue. The last two ways is by identifying the personal and economic concerns as the driving factors. So this unfolds in two ways. One is the personal concern that much of political argument around AIDS activism in the 80s and 90s was that it was exclusively an issue for male homosexual communities or gay communities in the United States. So it's only a personal issue for them. And the other is thinking about the cost of research. So you're looking at what AZT costs and the public costs and those driving factors, which become increasingly public concerns. And then lastly is by challenging the authority of the technical or personal spheres, right? You challenge the authority of the scientists, the authority of the researchers to demand it gets seen as a public issue. The second argumentative practice that they're engaging in is the practice of translation. So for them, they're seeing translation as something that enables people with AIDS, doctors, and researchers to meet together in the public sphere, to discuss issues surrounding AIDS research and treatment together. So how do you do that? And what our authors are seeing is that activists become a very important intermediary So they're like your advocate if you are someone with AIDS, and they are your translator if you are deeply rooted in scientific communities. So Goodnight is telling us that scientists and research communities are very idiosyncratic and very only concerned with their technical rules. So it makes it much harder for them to get that information to the public in a way that they can understand it, and to the individuals who are living with the disease to understand it. So activists do two things. So they bring scientific information to people who have HIV/AIDS and help them understand what the conclusions of the scientific community are doing and saying about their everyday lived lives. And then they are also taking the needs of the individuals who are living and surviving with HIV/AIDS and bringing it to the technical sphere, right? And they are trying to break into this sphere so that they can advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. So this means two kind of things about translation. One, activism is a very tough, complicated job, and activists deserve so much more praise than I think that they tend to receive. Because you have to be able to understand and speak the language of scientific communities, as well as understand and speak the language of people who are living in the quotidian everyday lives of HIV/AIDS. And at the same time, there's a lot of persuasion and argument happening because you have to convince the medical field that you understand their language, right? You have to prove to them that you're smart enough, that you speak the language, that you know the needs, priorities, and interests, so that they believe and are convinced that you understand the conclusions that they're drawing and the issues that they are raising and putting most of their focus on. So these are the two argumentative practices of the public sphere that we see happening with AIDS activists. They're doing this redefinition and they're engaging in translation. The last thing that is kind of helpful to think about is that our authors are also beginning to define the definitions of both public as engaging, which engages people as members of a community, transcending their individual concerns, and sphere as the forum that gets demanded by the public to engage in these issues. So it's kind of breaking down the pieces of that puzzle so that you can start weaving the pieces of that puzzle into Goodnight's spheres of arguments and other interpretations of spheres. So the last thing that I would say is this kind of sparks a couple of questions that I would encourage you to explore. The first one is, how important do you think it is to engage the technical sphere in order for activism to be successful? Are they right that you have to be able to penetrate the technical sphere for your activism to be successful? Or is that just a tactic that was successful for AIDS activists? What do you think? The second is, as we've been watching arguments unfold around COVID-19 and the coronavirus, or Rona, which is what people seem to be wanting to call it, I wonder how a claim that our authors make reference to us early applies. So our authors to engage an ethical claim that vital and active publics are important to a democratic society, and that the personal and technical spheres hinder our responses to crises, essentially, because they become barriers for a vital, active public. And what I'm curious is, do you see that unfolding with the coronavirus conversations, or how do you see that unfolding when you look at the coronavirus? Are the personal and technical spheres hindering public engagements or effective public engagement on these topics? Think about that and feel free, right? So these are questions that you would feel free to engage with or explore in the second topic in the discussion page. So, and as we move from that, I think this gets us to start thinking about some of the concerns we might want to address with public engagement and activism and arguments around health and medicine. So Phaedra Pazzulo's article about National Breast Cancer Awareness Month becomes a helpful vehicle for us to start thinking about this. While the AIDS activism article reveals the benefits of medical activism, Pazzulo introduces to you kind of the dark side or some of those limitations, while showing you the way in which activists are responding to that. So she is doing a couple of very interesting things. The first is she is making important comparative analyses between environmental activism and women's activism around breast cancer. And the second is she is introducing us to the way in which hegemonic communities, businesses, corporations, and people in what you would kind of think of as like the general public are adapting to these issues. So we're given October, which is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and we see this practice of pinkwashing occur, which is driven or derived. Yeah, you derive it from greenwashing. So if you've learned a little bit about environmental activism, what you see is that greenwashing is not only the greening of the appearance of products. So when you go to the grocery store, you see green labels and green coloring, and you see the, like at Kroger, you've got Simple Truth, which is this green logo for the organic and green and better for the environment packaging for all of your items, or you see the glass bottles or the whatever, right, to encourage you to think that a brand is more environmentally friendly. So you see that greening of the appearance of products and commodity consumption, but also you see a deliberate disavowal of environmental impacts and environmental effects. So because somebody calls themselves green or engages in a green campaign, they can ignore the way in which their plants pollute the environment still. Because I got my chicken from a nice local farm, but we still sent it through the factory that pollutes the water. Right? Those kinds of contradictions. And she extends that logic and relates it to what she calls pinkwashing, right, which is the talk about women that doesn't necessarily empower women. And the big key example of that she looks at is or makes reference to, is the big example of breast cancer and the prioritization of women's concerns about their appearance rather than the concerns about survival rates, scarring, poison in their body, and everything else, right? Like, thank you for saving women's breasts, but letting them die, right? Is what we kind of see as pinkwashing as it unpacks. And so from these kind of contradictions that appear within American society, Pazzulo presents us an argument. Her argument is that public debates over breast cancer are currently constrained in ways that are inextricably linked to environmental and gender discourses. And so the way that you get introduced to this is this long explanation of the factors of publics. So the biggest and most important kind of portion of this article that you'll want to unpack and try and map is the introduction of public spheres and counterpublics. So you're given multiple definitions of public spheres. You're introduced to this idea of nested publics. You're introduced to the way in which power relations, issues of oppression and discrimination play roles in people's access to the public or to publics. And so you're then introduced to the idea of counterpublics, which can be parallel discursive arenas for oppressed groups to build their own senses of identity and challenge hegemonic discourses, which tends to be the kind of biggest aspect of that. And our example to kind of unpack this is looking at activists who are challenging Breast Cancer Awareness Month as an environmentally problematic practice, because it's all major manufactured products where all of these corporations, right, like Breast Cancer Awareness Month happens and Forever 21 and everybody else has their pink hoodies, and you put your pink label and with your pink ribbon on all of these products that are environmentally damaging. Okay, cool, right? You're like, thank you for showing me that you care about breast cancer while contributing to the carcinogen levels that cause and can cause women to have breast cancer, which she's looking at through the extension of toxic tour campaigns to the companies that are the worst for doing this, right? For putting out their pink products while polluting the environment. So what you should attempt to do and try to do as you're reading this article is see if you can figure out how you can map publics. So across all 3 or 4, if you include last week's article, how are you mapping a public spheres, the arguments, counter publics, nested publics, etc.? How do you map all of those things together? And then how do you watch that unfold with a controversy like National Breast Cancer Awareness Month? And then if you think you've kind of got it figured out, start to see how you can watch that unfold for different communities related to the coronavirus. And if you're getting hung up, having trouble with some of that, that's where it's a good place to start answering or asking questions and figuring out what is it that you don't quite understand and what is it that you can get figured out. So I think that these are wonderful articles to start thinking about and start applying these cases and examples on top of the controversies and the different kind of responses that we've had. Another thing that is particularly interesting is to now start thinking about how, so both of the articles that we read were written in the late 90s or the early 2000s, and so it's before the kind of technological explosion that we've had. So I'm curious how Twitter activism and internet and digital activism shapes, changes, or alters how we understand public spheres and how we understand activism as a response to hegemonic publics. So those are questions also to consider exploring. I feel like I've given you at least 12 questions throughout all of this. So we'll see where things go. The last thing that I will say to you all is if there are concerns, whether it's with volume, with how fast I'm talking, with something else that's going on with these videos, please feel free to share them with me. We're all kind of figuring this out together. My hope is that if I have to continue teaching online, this will be a great test case for how we get this all figured out. Although I'm very sad about not being in the classroom with all of you guys. You know, that fake breaking of voices. But I hope that everybody is doing okay. I hope that everybody's making it through. And feel free to join. So Friday, 2 p.m., I'll post a link in an announcement on iCollege with a link to my office hours if you have questions, want to talk, chit chat. Otherwise, keep reading, keep going, keep being amazing. You all got this.